What I've chosen to do today is to take a look at imperialism. It's sort of a abstract and probably a topic that most of you may not have thought a great deal about. But the history of the United States, it's been integral to becoming what we are and how we conduct our affairs in the world as yet. We did not begin as an imperial country. As a matter of fact, no country of the world probably could have been called imperial truly in the 18th century. It is a concept mostly that has its impact in the 19th and into the 20th century, but it does speak to who we are and what we are. So what was imperialism looking like in the 19th and 20th centuries? If you take a look at the Eastern and European and African and Australian world and just take a look at colors, what you see there is a lot of red. And who was the red? The red was the United Kingdom. And it is said that 25% of the people of the world at one time lived under the British flag. And you can see there was a lot of red. They were a major imperialist nation, as was France, the blue nations that you see especially in Africa and in Asia. So most notable and most scandalous, as far as I'm concerned, is something called the Berlin Conference, which took place in 1884-85. It regulated European colonization and trade in Africa during the new imperialism period. And interestingly, it coincided with Germany suddenly emerges as an imperial power. And Germany was sort of late to the party. And they said, hey, we want our share too. So the interesting thing about this conference was it was all white, because it said all male here as well, Europeans, no Africans, and yet they were taking the African continent and they were dividing it up. And this is how they divided it up. As you can see, the green, a lot of green there is, including Madagascar off to the right, that is France, and it still has a great French influence. All up and down the eastern part of Africa, except for German East Africa, you had a string of United Kingdom dominated countries. And then as well, you had the Gold Coast and Nigeria and so forth. There were only two independent countries in Africa. One was over on the Guinea coast. It was called Liberia, established by the United States as a place to send our slaves. And then old Abyssinia, which today we know as Ethiopia, over on the eastern coast. The only independent nations in all of that huge continent, which is 5 times the size of the United States, 5 times the size. So you see, there were German influence, German East Africa and German Southwest Africa. You also had the Portuguese with Mozambique and Angola, the Belgian Congo, which was largely the possession of King Leopold himself. But see how it was divided up. It also took place in Asia. Now, China was an independent country, but it wasn't much of a country in the 19th century. It existed covering a lot of geography. And then there is Japan, and then poor Korea that gets kicked around back and forth and up and down, and later Manchuria, which becomes a Japanese possession. You have the Dutch, who had the Dutch East Indies, and then you see that Britain had India, what is today Pakistan, Bangladesh, Burma, and so forth. You did not see the United States color there at all, except for the Philippines, and that will come up in a little bit. Pacific Islands, too, were important. And why would they be interested in islands way out in the middle of the Pacific? Well, if you think about how was economic activity taking place during the 19th century? It was taking place on ships. There were no planes. And so in order for a ship to go from one place to the other, it needed fuel. What kind of fuel did they use in the 19th and into the 20th century? Coal. And so coal, you can only carry so much at one time. And so they conveniently acquired islands that became coal depositories, so they could go from one to the other and refuel. We're going to take a look at traditional foreign policy, the definition of imperialism, and the reasons and rationalizations for imperialism. Our traditional United States foreign policy was isolationist. Here we see our very fine first president of the United States, George Washington. And in 1796, he made this very prescient statement: "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." The United States was able to accomplish that and did steer clear of permanent alliances until after World War II, and then we joined NATO. Now, how were we able to do that? Conveniently, we had a moat on our east side called the Atlantic Ocean, and on the west side, the Pacific Ocean, that kept other powers from coveting some of our land. Most of the 19th century was spent exploring and settling the western frontier of the United States, and this changed the perception of American boundaries. We were moving west in a major way. Question: was this a form of imperialism too? We were taking lands from what had been Native Americans and the Mexicans, and we were making it into our country. So what is called was manifest destiny, lovely term, extended beyond the borders of the United States. A man by the name of Sullivan, I think in 1844 or 45, in writing about, he called it our manifest destiny. And here is one of the most intriguing allegories you're ever going to see. It is an allegory that describes manifest destiny. If you take a look at this particular painting, you will see that the central figure of Columbia is headed in what direction? She's headed west, guiding the pioneers and settlers. And this sounds like there's some providential purpose to what she's doing. The expansion and direction of the pioneers and settlers is going to the Pacific Ocean in the west. Native Americans are shown fleeing from progress, using the horse and travel as their only means of transport, emphasizing the past pervasive belief in American culture and racial superiority. The pioneers, traders, and prospectors are then represented by a group of people. These are followed by farmers cultivating the field with the use of the plow. The early horse-drawn stagecoach is a historical reminder of one of the early forms of transport. The background depicts steamboats on river or canal. There are 3 railroad lines shown here. One's hard to see up in the top. The covered wagon or prairie schooner reflects the settlers' transportation method along the Oregon Trail and other places that they went west. A lone rider in the background behind the wagon, you see where it is right there, represents the communication via the Pony Express. The Pony Express was replaced by the telegraph and Morse code, and here you see the telegraph line being strung to the west. This is a painting by John Gass done in 1872, and today it is in the Autry Museum in California. But it's it's one of those, it's an allegory taken almost to the extreme. Very famous painting. Definition of imperialism: the policy of extending a nation's authority by territorial acquisition or by the establishment of economic and political hegemony over other nations. Reasons and rationalizations for imperialism. Now, why did we do this? Why was anybody going to take other people's land? What was the motivation? First of all, you want to gain more power and prestige in the international area by following the European example. Power and prestige. Missionary zeal. They were bringing the word of God. They had to bring people to Jesus. To gain more wealth. Greed, of course, highly at work here. It really is another version of what we call the 3 Gs: guns, God, and gold. The reason why other countries covet the lands of still other countries. Prestige, racial theories, economic growth, these are the other factors. Increased They increased America's interest in overseas expansion. Which was the most important to America in the 19th century? Wealth. We wanted to be wealthy. We were making billionaires repeatedly in the latter part of the 19th century, especially. And so this, you saw this map earlier, this is what the world came to look like. And as you can see, the most powerful nations would have been Great Britain, they would have been France, and they would have been Russia, although Russia itself not very powerful at that time. Its power comes later. Great Britain, a major power, served as a role model of an imperialist power. The characterization, like we know Uncle Sam, the characterization of Great Britain has always been John Bull. And here he is represented as an imperialist octopus reaching out into Canada and Egypt and India and Jamaica and Boer's Land, which is South Africa, and Australia, just all these places in the world that he's reaching out towards. That, by the way, is why most of the world speaks English too. English is really not the very best language ever discovered or patented or developed by mankind. But because the British spread it all over the world, almost every part of the world speaks English, or at least knows a little English. Missionary zeal, the desire to convert heathens or non-believers, led to people moving to uncivilized areas in hopes of helping the natives. I remember I was a little boy, and that Lutheran school or Lutheran church up in northwestern Minnesota, there was one woman who had gone off into the missionary field, and she was in Madagascar. And they kept a framed picture of her sitting on the piano in the lounge, and she was worshiped as a wonderful example of how a good Christian should be. Here's a guy called, whose name is Herbert Spencer. And he developed the idea of social Darwinism. And it was based on Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and said that the wealthy should therefore dominate the poor who are weak. The United States, as a strong nation, must dominate the weaker nations. At the time, many of these nations believed that Anglo-Saxons were destined to dominate the world due to their superior race and culture. Anyway, great philosopher Herbert Spencer, who developed the theory of social Darwinism. It's a corrupt idea, but it portrayed itself along the way. Here's a famous poem written in 1899, The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. And I just took a look at the first verse. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen people, half devil and half child. Really, this is not considered to be great poetry, but it was emblematic of the time, and talked very much about imperialism. So how is the burden portrayed? Here we see one cartoon with old Uncle Sam. In this case, it happens to be Teddy Roosevelt, the white man's burden. He's carrying this very aboriginal, almost animal-like character to the schoolhouse. And so that is the burden. We have these people, we're now responsible for them. We have to educate them. Here's another cartoon where it says, I don't like the job, Rudyard, my boy. Rudyard Kipling had written the poem. But notice they were complaining about the cost of the military, the cost to pay for reparations to places like the Philippines, claims for pensions and so forth. It was very controversial around 1900. Admiral Dewey, considered hero of the Spanish-American War, here he's washing his hands in the commercial exploitation of what's called the white man's burden. The white man's burden, notice it's soap. Now the implication here is that these aboriginal people of other nations are dirty, and therefore it is our responsibility to rescue them and clean things up. And Pear's soap is the ideal product to get that job done. The United States then became an imperialist power because we're like Germany, we're late to the party. But we needed to and wished to gain more wealth. The United States needed new markets to export the surplus products of its farms and factories. And notice how it grows from 1870, 300 million in imports to 1.6 billion by the eve of the First World War. Exports go from 350 million to 2.8 billion. A lot of money to be made. This is a famous senator from Indiana, Senator Alfred Beveridge. And in 1898, he gives this statement, and he's talking about how our commerce will spread. And then he goes on to talk about the people around the world as benighted, ignorant peoples will know the voice of liberty is speaking at last for them, that civilization is dawning at last for them. What a pompous attitude, but it was the attitude of the powers that be in the United States around 1900. This is a very famous man, Alfred Thayer Mahan, and he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And it influenced people's thinking that you had to have major battleships, you had to dominate the sea. In fact, that was what Great Britain had done, and it had served them well. Great Britain dominates the seas from 1588 when they defeat the Spanish Armada, really until they get it to the 20th century. And it was the British and American ships that win the first turning point, or one of the two main turning points of World War II, which is the Battle of the Atlantic. And all the battleships, or all the ships, really, not only battleship, all the ships around 1900 were coal-burning battleship, or were coal-burning ships. First attempts at imperialism. We acquire Hawaii in 1898. Samoa, 1889, it's a protectorate of ours, and then we acquire them in 1900. America's first attempt at imperialism took place at Samoa. Samoa is our most southerly possession today. We have Eastern Samoa as part of the United States possessions. And there is also a Western Samoa. And it is one part of our possessions that is south of the equator. Which country was also trying to intervene in Samoa? Well, if you take a look there, you see in the middle, you have the German, who is represented by that interesting hat, helmet that they wore or noted to wear. And we are the eagle, and then that's John Bull on the left. So we're trying to outweigh the Germans. So the Germans, remember I said earlier, were late to the party, and so they were very aggressive in acquiring territories around the world. Hawaii itself, which had been originally called the Sandwich Islands, was greatly influenced by missionaries from the United States. They had a major presence in Hawaii, and therefore there were a lot of Anglos there, a lot of Americans rather. We were then telling places like Great Britain, listen, we are using the Monroe Doctrine to extend to Hawaii. Don't mess with Hawaii. We told you to stay out of South America, and largely we were successful in that because of the Monroe Doctrine. Now we're extending it to cover Hawaii. We want no foreign interference. This is our sphere of influence. Here she is, the famous Queen Liliuokalani, who was the last queen of Hawaii through 1894. And this is her, I believe, in about 1920, near the end of her life. She was overthrown, and she was overthrown largely by this man, Sanford Dole, who became president of the Republic of Hawaii after the queen was overthrown. Hawaii was annexed by the United States in 1898. Now, the president at the time that Queen was overthrown was President Cleveland. And President Cleveland was Mr. No. He didn't want anything to do with acquiring territories. This was not what the United States should be about. Well, we had an election, and in the election, we elect a man by the name of McKinley, and McKinley was Mr. Yes. And so he's anxious to acquire this. Now, what does Sanford Dole have to do with Hawaii? I think if you go to your grocery store today, you will find out that the heir. He's the heir of all the pineapple that was grown there, as well as other products, and the Dole Company. Spanish-American War, the role of the media, the USS Maine, war in Cuba, and Teller Amendment, and finally the Philippines. So problems between Cuba and their Spanish rulers dominated American foreign policy at the end of the 19th century. Originally, virtually all of Latin America was Spanish. One country after the other becomes independent, most of them in the 1820s. But Cuba remains a possession. It's actually the last major possession of Spain. And we had coveted it because it's only 90 miles away from our coast. There was in 1854 a very famous meeting at Ostend, Belgium, in which an agreement was drawn up which fundamentally would have made Cuba part of the United States. And the idea, of course, greatly supported in the South in that period, was that it would eventually become a slave state. When news of this negotiation took place, it was so disgraced that they had to abandon it, and Cuba has to wait another 50 years before it becomes part or becomes a possession. Here's an interesting character called the Yellow Man, and he deals with sensationalism and crude exaggeration. There was a war between publishers during this period, Pulitzer's New York World and Sanford Hearst's New York Journal. And here you see them fighting over war, dressed in the yellow kid outfits, and they are each pushing for war, and they do this by engaging in press that is sensational and crude exaggeration. It's not quite a lie, but it's not quite the truth either. Yellow journalism. We still call bad journalism today that is sensational and so forth, yellow journalism. This is the cartoon where the term yellow journalism came from. In 1898, the newspapers provided the public with information. The public lacked the ability to verify if the stories were based on inaccurate or were inaccurate, and therefore relied upon newspapers to tell the truth. Pulitzer and Hearst took advantage of the public's ignorance by twisting the truth to sell more newspapers. Sensationalized stories were featured heavily in their newspapers since exciting stories increased circulation. And today, the tabloids are where yellow journalism is most prominent. But if our major newspapers and our major television networks are doing their job, they are presenting history objectively. And we need that kind of coverage because none of us can know everything about every issue. Newspapers, therefore, during this time focused on Spanish atrocities towards the Cuban people to ignite passions against Spain. And there were numerous cartoons that were done to do this. And also there was a Spanish general, Weyler, who was seen and portrayed as a butcher in the US for his treatment of the Cuban people. This young lady achieved a lot of attention. Beautiful, right? Evangelina Cisneros. We had US attitudes towards women were that they needed to be protected, that they were delicate, that they needed to be honored, and so forth. Well, in writing about this, Hearst focused on a young woman who was imprisoned in Havana. Petitions for her freedom were signed by prominent US women and the Pope and addressed to the Queen Regent of Spain. Evangelina managed to escape with the help of correspondent Carl Decker, who probably bribed her guards. The story presented to the public was that of a heroic journalist that acts, and so it just captivated the public very much and inflamed them. All that was now needed to start a war with Spain was a spark. And this came on February 15th, 1898 in Havana Harbor. The USS Maine, one of our major battleships during that time, was at that time on a trip, and it was in Havana Harbor. And it was blown up mysteriously. This is very interesting film, and I'll talk over it. It is really a historic collection. It was one of the earliest movies ever done by Thomas Alva Edison. Now, it doesn't really show you much, to be quite honest with you, but it is one ship going by the wreck of the Maine in Havana Harbor. It was eventually, many years later, it was raised from this position and was taken far out to sea, and it was then sunk. And so there's some thought that we should try to break it back up again. I don't think that's ever going to happen. But anyway, that's the wreck of the Maine. Historic film because it's among the first movie film that we have in 1898. Yellow journalists were quick to blame the Spanish, and these are a couple of the newspapers from the time. Notice the words they're using. Crisis is at hand. Spanish treachery. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. $50,000 reward. That was a huge amount during that time. Naval officers think the Maine was destroyed by a Spanish mine. Assistant Secretary of Navy at that time, Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, was convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. What's the message of this cartoon? Notice how they're portraying Spain as this ugly, like gorilla type beast. And then the grave of the Maine sailors murdered by Spain, and the bloody knife that he's holding, and he's stamping on the flag and Constitution of the United States with dead bodies in the background, obviously meant to inflame public attitude. What does this cartoon suggest is the situation for the Cubans? There's the noble Cubans, and they are in the hot pan, or the frying pan of Spanish misrule, which is being heated by anarchy, and they're going to be forced to jump out of that. And so anyway, it's one of the cartoons from the time. Here is a painting by a man by the name of Charles Johnson, who painted a number of paintings from this period. And the troops were mobilizing for war, and at Tampa was at that time about the southernmost port that could be used in the United States. Wasn't much down here at Miami and Fort Lauderdale. Here's a picture of soldiers breaking down camp. This is the 17th U.S. Infantry, and they're in preparation for their move in El Caney, Cuba. And more people suffered from disease during this particular war than anything else. In the background, not very clearly, you can see a Signal Corps observation balloon. Pictures also weren't very good during this period. Here's a picture of the Gatling gun, which originally was used minorly in the Civil War and then perfected as the years went by. And this is about the end of the Gatling gun. They still used it in the war, but it's soon going to be replaced by other machine guns in the 20th century. Here's the battle scene with Teddy Roosevelt on his horse, again painted by Charles Johnson, who made him look heroic in everything that he did. Teddy Roosevelt, was blind as a bat, and so he had to have glasses that he wore, and so he had a whole bunch of glasses stuffed into his uniform so he could change them as he lost them. Here is, in fact, a picture of him posing with his Rough Riders in Cuba. Again, another Charles Johnson portrayal of the battle. Here are some Army nurses during the Spanish-American War. And here's another Edison film called A Skirmish of the Rough Riders. And I have never figured out exactly what's being portrayed, and I suspect it was posed, but it's supposedly a skirmish where they're firing and fighting, and I don't know who's doing what to who. But anyway, it's significant because it is so early a film that we can now show something of the period. It's a big breakthrough, if you would. Anyway. I suspect they are acting, but we won't know for sure. And then this one is called The Shooting of Captured Insurgents. And this one is posed, I believe it's posed By the way, you see the soldiers marching the prisoners across to position, and then they line up the prisoners. And the captain, I suppose he's a captain, he goes over and gets in line and he gets his sword up ready to the command. They get their guns and they shoot and they kill these people. Did it really happen that way? I don't know, but it is important historic film. It's at the Library of Congress. The Teller Amendment, 1898. Obviously, too many words here for us to spend much time about, but they introduced the Teller Amendment in 1898. It wants to guarantee the independence of Cuba. And so it goes on, and it says, resolved that the people of the island of Cuba are and of right ought to be free and independent. Second, the duty of the United States to demand, and the government of the United States does hereby demand, that Spain relinquish its authority in government. Third, the President of the United States is hereby directed to use the entire United States forces to call upon the actual service of the United States, the militia, to extent as necessary. Fourth, the United States here disclaims any disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty. In other words, we're going to go in there, we're going to liberate these people, we're going to give them freedom, and then we're going to go home. That's kind of enlightened imperialism, eh? The US, at the same time, we conquered the Philippines, off in Asia. The first battle between American and Spanish forces was at Manila Bay, and that's blanked out, where on May 1, 1898, Dewey, commanding the US naval forces in a matter of hours, defeated the Spanish. He did this with only 9 wounded. The Asiatic squadron destroyed the Spanish fleet and captured Manila's harbor. And these are paintings that depict this battle. It was an annihilation of the Spanish fleet at that time in Manila Harbor. Admiral Dewey, the hero of the naval battle of Manila Bay. Teddy Roosevelt, at this time, is Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And the Long, who is the Secretary of the Navy, was a pretty lazy guy. He liked to go to lunch a lot. And as a result, Teddy Roosevelt was able to assert a lot of authority. And so he had been giving commands that had the fleet ready to go in the event something happened. And that's while Secretary Long went to lunch, Roosevelt issued orders. The Battle of Manila Bay was on May 1, 1898. Roosevelt resigned May 10th, and he went off to organize his Rough Riders, which he didn't want to miss out on the battle. He didn't want to miss out on the fighting. He wanted to be a hero, and he did become a hero. He went and he fought effectively a Battle of San Juan Hill and some other locations in Cuba. Argument in favor of imperialism in the Philippines. Here's again our Senator Beveridge, Republican from Indiana, January 9th, 1900. And he is talking in here, it's a long statement, about markets. Where shall we turn for consumers for our surplus? And he said, and then talks about they, meaning the Filipinos, are a barbarous race, modified by 3 centuries of contact with a decadent race, the Spanish. It's barely possible that 1,000 men in all the archipelago are capable of self-government in the Anglo-Saxon sense. The Declaration of Independence applies only to people capable of self-government. And he ends in, he said, if you deny it to the Indian at home, how can you grant it to the Malay abroad? Anyway, such racial prejudice was a terrible time in US history for that purpose. Arguments against imperialism, and there was a lot of argument against it during this time. It was a whole body of rejection of this as a concept. Among them was Mark Twain, who said, we do not intend to free, but to subjugate the people of the Philippines. We have gone there to conquer, not to redeem. And of course, William Jennings Bryan, the perennial presidential candidate, he says, in the forcible annexation of the Philippines, our nation neither adds to its strength nor secures broader opportunities for the American people. One result of the Spanish-American War was a reconciliation between the North and South, helping to end the legacy of bitterness since the Civil War. many veterans of the Civil War are still alive at this point. It's only been 40 years. They're getting to be elderly or older men, and they do have some. This has a commonality. They could unite behind this cause. So as that wasn't enough, the U.S. occupies 2 more Spanish colonial possessions. This is when we take Puerto Rico, which is still a territory of the United States, and when we take Guam, that's off in the far Pacific as well. They are still both part of the United States. And this is an interesting cartoon. Here we see Uncle Sam, who's seated at a restaurant table. And he says, we hardly know which one to take first. Well, I hardly know which one to take first. And he has up there the Philippines, Cuba as the Cuba steak, his Puerto Rico as the Puerto Rico pig, is the Philippine floating islands, and the Sandwich Islands, which of course are Hawaii. And what do we acquire as we become an imperial power? Hawaii in 1898, Midway Island in 1867, much earlier, Alaska 1867, Wake Island 1898, Guam 1898, Johnston Island 1898, Palmyra Island 1898, the Philippines 1898, Puerto Rico 1898, Samoa 1899. And a little later, we'll mention it in a moment, the Virgin Islands, we buy them from Denmark in 1917. And so we are now an imperial power. We're like the bad countries of Europe. We came late to the party, but we did get to participate. Reaction to US imperialism. There was an anti-imperialist movement. And this is one of the cartoons portraying it. And you have imperialism with, just destroying Uncle Sam. You have anyway, it's just, it was a very strong movement in the United States. We didn't want to be like the other countries of the world. And that's Napoleon down there that they're showing. And this is another one, a cartoon from Puck at that time. Puck magazine was very important. And this one endorsed the foreign policy of President McKinley. Notice the stripes on his pants. They are they are territories that have been acquired, like Hawaii and Puerto Rico and so forth. And that has the other characters who were important during this time. And this was called Enlightened Foreign Policy. So they were supporters as well. That's Wirtz, who has got the jug there. And he was the leader of the German community in the United States during that time, Karl Wirtz. So what role did the US play? Here again, you see the United States represented by Uncle Sam. The babies are Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba and Hawaii, and they are all bad children, and they are all demanding attention, and they are all, and so poor Uncle Sam, what can he do? Remember that the literacy of the United States was still somewhat limited in 1900. It was pretty good, but there were a lot of people for whom a picture was worth 1,000 words. Here you have Colombia with the scales of justice, and she's, we're contemplating the Philippine Islands. Should we take the Philippine Islands? And then there is the legacy in the background of lynching and the abuse of our own Black population. And so, is justice possible? Civilization begins at home. So who are the 2 figures staring down at President McKinley? Who do they represent? Well, they are, of course, Napoleon, and they are Caesar. So the question that's being asked, is he to be a despot? And of course, they're representing the minorities in the most grotesque and in an uncomplimentary way. So the open door and Japanese imperialism with spheres of influence, the Boxer Rebellion, and an open door policy. Japan itself becomes imperialist. Here is a kind of a dull painting. It's a little hard to tell, but in the center you see China that is depicted as a dragon. And you have the Russian bear on the left, the United States eagle in the background. You have the British lion to the right. And so they are all, trying to devour and destroy this Chinese weak country. And China was weak. And so foreign intervention in China took center stage at the end of the 19th century. Russia goes in 1896-98 into the northern part of China. Britain goes into Beijing in 1898. Germany in the Shanghai area. Britain also in 1842. The various spheres of influence develop, where at that time Japan did control Korea, and then there was a sphere of influence that went beyond where Korea itself was. The Russians had a sphere of influence in the north. And we have other various countries, Russia, China, they're all playing a role here. And China is so weak, poorly governed. Boxer Rebellion, some of the people in China rebelled in 1900, enough. They reacted to some of this imperialism. It's called the Boxer Rebellion, because many of these people had been boxing fighters, and so that's why the term boxers is applied to them. But they were revolutionaries. Boxer troops entered the foreign-held Peking. See, Peking, Beijing, it's kind of various spellings. My understanding is that Beijing is the closest to a Chinese pronunciation that we could come up with. But our Western tongues have trouble with these foreign words. An international force retaliated and seized control of Peking, Beijing. Now, who do all the figures here represent? You can see the United States and Great Britain and the Russian bear. You can see the German, and the French, Italian. They're all there. Powers celebrating the fall of Pekin. This was another spelling of it. Somebody by the name of R.B. Mayfield in 1900. So who are the land grabbers? And why do you think Sam was trying to stop them? Well, they were all trying to take over and monopolize China. The United States, to its credit, Hay is the former assistant to Abraham Lincoln, is the Secretary of State, and he is the one who comes up with this open door policy saying, all right, we'll all participate in trade with China. Nobody is going to dominate all of China, called the open door policy. Here you see Uncle Sam reading the riot act to all of these other countries and telling them, none of you are going to monopolize this. We are all going to get a piece of this puzzle. Here's an anti-imperialist cartoon that I think is kind of cute. There are the poor Chinamen off in the far left. And then you have the various caricatures of the various countries, all with knives going after each other. They're all going to destroy China and taking our place among the nations. So there we get in the act as well. Japan now enters the stage as an industrial and imperialist power. Japan had been a closed country. Western powers were not welcome there, nor were there trading. There was no trading going on. Commodore Perry arrived in Japan in 1853, and he opened it for trade. He said, now listen, you can't just not participate with the rest of the world. Japan, once it saw what was happening in the rest of the world, realized they had to adopt some Western ways, or they were going to be conquered themselves. Scholars were therefore sent abroad to study, and within 50 years, Japan was an industrial power. They are very good imitators, very good learners, and they still are to this day. Japan became an imperialist power for fighting two wars. The first one was called the Sino-Japanese War with China, 1894-95, and then the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05, which they win. here are paintings or depictions of the fighting going on. Japan enters the world stage as an industrial power. Here are the areas controlled by Japan in 1906. They control, of course, all of the island, Sakhalin Island up to the north, which today is half Russian. They control Korea, and they control what is a part of Manchuria. And they had modern battleships, and they had the capacity to manufacture them. Now, to show the naval power of the United States in 1907, Teddy Roosevelt has all of our battleships painted white, and then he sails them around the world to every major port in order to tell the world, look here, we are coming in peace, but we have might, we have strength, we have power, watch out. Panama Canal. So there was a recognition of a need for a canal. Panama Revolution, building the canal. Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy, what was it? It was to speak softly or carry a big stick, famous cartoon from this period. What international role did Roosevelt envision for the United States? Well, he sees us being the big policeman for Latin America. And we were. In many cases, we intervened again and again in Latin America. It was known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which says, okay, if there's problems down there, we'll come in and we'll fix it. But we're going to keep Europe out of the process. We will, this is our backyard, we're going to take care of it. It's a Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. U.S. interests turned towards Central America in a quicker way of moving ships between the east and west coasts of North America. To do shipping, it was a 15,000-mile trip, 15,000 miles. The advantage of an Isthmian canal would reduce it to 8,000 miles. So there was a significant financial incentive for trade to do some kind of canal. The Hay-Paunce-Fort Treaty in 1901, in which the U.S. and Great Britain agreed that the U.S. would be given the sole right to construct, control, and defend a Central American canal. The French had tried it in the 1880s under Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who was successful in getting the Suez Canal constructed. But in this case, he was not successful. He failed to get his canal built, and part of the reason was they didn't know how to deal with the disease that was rampant in the central area of Panama. So what site were they going to find for a canal in Central America? Well, first of all, they took a look at Nicaragua, and as you see, there's a big lake there. And that is still a viable route. And sometime in the future, there may be another canal that is built to go across that part of the Central America. But instead, they chose this part of Panama, which was then part of Colombia, which was the complication. It was part of a nation. And Colombia was not being very cooperative. So this is where they were going to put it. By the way, it goes, you think you're going from east to west, but in fact, you are going from northwest to southeast when you travel through the Panama Canal. Colombia in 1902, that part we today know as Panama was sticking up there to the upper left. These are two political cartoons on Colombia. FDR made a proposal to offer $40 million for us to construct the canal. Offer that to Colombia. And here are two cartoons rather, who are talking about Colombia's refusal to accept TR's purchase offer price of $40 million. Today, the $40 million would be worth at least $1.5 billion. Still would be a bargain. Roosevelt's solution was he stimulated a revolution. He quietly kept in the background, but he's the one who caused the revolution to take place among the Panamanians. And then later we felt a little bit guilty. And in 1921, we paid Colombia 25 million as a way of apologizing. So they didn't get their 40 million, but they did get 25 million. Yellow fever was the problem. In Cuba, we fortunately had Dr. Gorgas, who learned yellow fever was transmitted through mosquitoes. And once they were able to control that, the canal could be built. They practiced all kinds of fumigation and all kinds of other practices that in fact curtailed the yellow fever. Here's a picture showing the canal being constructed. It was quite a monumental effort. McCullough has written an excellent book about this. You should get a hold of it, read it if you're interested. President Roosevelt went down to visit the canal site, and he was the first president to leave the US borders. By the way, he's the first president to ride in a US automobile. He's also the first president to fly in an airplane. He is quite a fellow, a little bit strong perhaps, but the times needed. Here is a picture of the Miraflores locks in Panama, so you see how huge they are. And of course, they move very smoothly. This has worked again for over 100 years. 1914, the canal was opened. And it's still, that particular part of the canal is still being used. But today they have added another canal beside it, which will now take larger ships. It cannot take the most mega tankers in the world, but it still takes very large ships to go through. At the time it was opened, it was the biggest and most complex engineering project ever. They spent $375 million. It was very expensive. And it was a great success then and continues to be a success. And billions of shipping go through there, all that, billions of shipping. So now they've added a third set of locks big enough to handle the biggest ships. The new locks have a usable length of 1,400 feet. If you can think about it, I suppose that ship that's sitting crosswise in the Suez Canal and blocking that, that's 1,300 feet. So it could, in theory, go into this particular canal, new canal, 180 feet wide. The original locks were only 1,000 feet long and 110 feet wide. It cost 15 to 25 billion. Began in 2007, in which there was a referendum in Panama, in which 3/4 of the voters approved the subtopic. Here's some shipping going through the Panama Canal. I've never been, many of you have been on cruises that go that way. In 1917, the United States bought the Virgin Islands from Denmark for 25 million. Again, a coaling or refueling station for merchant and warships, and they still are one of our possessions off there. A very beautiful place. Now, just to summarize, there were, in this early 19th century, 3 different approaches to diplomacy. 3 different approaches: big stick diplomacy, dollar diplomacy, and moral diplomacy. The one practiced by Teddy Roosevelt can only be called big stick diplomacy. Speak softly and carry a big stick. And we've got lots of power and we're going to use it, but we're going to talk softly to you. We're going to use persuasion. We're going to be nice to you until you don't respond. But it was very effective. On the other hand, his successor, William Howard Taft, practiced what is called dollar diplomacy, in which we did financial promotion and we supported and tried to help different countries grow and become more modernized and to help their economies and so forth. And so we used our money to try to persuade and lead them. And then finally, it's hard for the idea, he's really kind of an immoral man in many ways, but President Roosevelt practices what's called moral diplomacy, in which he talks about how higher-minded we are and how we try to practice standards of justice and fair play. And it is his way of approaching. Now, this is my final thought for today. Question is, we're everywhere. Is this too a form of imperialism? The military of the United States today, 2021, is deployed in more than 150 countries around the world. 150 countries. We have more than 160,000 of our active duty personnel stationed outside the United States and its territories. Is this some form of imperialism? Outside of active combat, U.S. personnel are typically deployed as part of several peacekeeping missions. They're part of embassies or consulate kinds of security. And this one, though, frightens me a little bit. Nearly 40,000 are assigned to classified missions in locations that the United States government refuses to disclose. So what's that all about? I don't know, but I raise rhetorically the question, is this too a form of imperialism? Or is this the right thing to do? Especially when we talk about liberating people around the world. And so that is the end of our presentation today, another part of the never-ending American saga.